So Latham snipe, they breed predominantly in Japan. In fact, I'm going to just use a little, I saw someone do this the other day, yesterday, and I thought it was amazing. Oh yeah, look at that. Anyway, so Latham snipe breed in Japan. This map is from BirdLife International, so it is a little bit out of date now, but their main breeding areas are northern Hokkaido, or they do breed on the island of Honshu still, and they also breed on the island of Sakhalin. And the population migrates down to eastern Australia, and the sort of core or hotspot region for the species is down here in southeastern Australia. So they arrive in Japan and Russia around mid to late April, and they spend the breeding season there until about July, August, and they depart and turn up in Australia around mid-August. So while we know quite a bit about where they occur within their distribution, what we really haven't had a good understanding of over time is where exactly they migrate. And of course, obviously they migrate from Australia to Japan and back again, but we haven't really known much about what the exact routes they use. And probably more importantly, particularly for the conservation of the species, is we haven't had any good understanding about what sites they might be stopping at or staging at on their northward and southward migration. So Papua New Guinea, or the island of New Guinea, is right in the middle of their migration pathway between the two countries. Back in the early days, it was hypothesized that the birds either flew directly across the Pacific to Japan and back again, or that they migrate up through the Philippines and Taiwan. And there really was no information to say which was more likely at the time. And certainly there wasn't really anything to give us much indication of, to what extent the species uses the New Guinea island on migration. So there are two Gallinago species that are most common in Papua New Guinea: Latham snipe, of course, the subject of this talk, and Swinhoe's snipe. And the interesting thing is that if you look at all the accounts of the two Gallinago species from New Guinea, you'll find that Swinhoe's snipe is considered the most common species there, and that Latham snipe is considered fairly rare on the island. So the information I'm presenting to you today is from a bigger project that we've been running in Australia for about 6 years. It's called the Latham Snipe Project. We've been trying to do some tracking using geolocators as well as satellite transmitters, but we also run a national survey program, and that is conducted 3 times a year. In Japan, the Wild Bird Society of Japan has been surveying Latham snipe for about the same period of time, and they have also conducted a number of satellite tracking trials, as well as conducting breeding ground surveys, which is the only comprehensive census information we have for the species at the moment. So in Australia, our first attempts at tracking were using light level geolocators, which I'm sure everybody in the audience is very, very familiar with. So this is the little 1 gram Integio units. We deployed 39 transmitters in southeastern Australia in the state of Victoria in 2015 to 2016, and then we deployed a further 15 geolocators in Canberra in the following year. And we put an awful lot of effort into trying to retrieve these geolocators, but we were not very successful at our retrievals, so we only managed to get 2 birds back that had full migration tracks on their devices. So one was retrieved in Victoria in 2016 and another one 2 years later in Canberra. So the bird that was recaptured in Victoria, famous, we consider it the famous T0, probably not really that famous, but we were very excited by this retrieval. It was actually the first bird we ever caught, so it was quite serendipitous, I think, to recapture this bird. So this bird, so here's southwest Victoria down here. So this bird migrated through southeast Queensland, where it spent about 2 months somewhere around this part of sort of central southeast Queensland. It migrated up through Cape York or Papua New Guinea. Now, anyone who knows light level geolocated data, it's fairly coarse in resolution. And for Latham snipe, that's even more so because the birds spend much of their time down in the vegetation, which obscures the light signal. So reconstructing exact locations is quite difficult. So we know the birds spent about 3 weeks here on northward migration. We can't be confident whether it was the tip of Australia or the southern part of New Guinea. It's flown to southern Hokkaido where it spent the breeding season, and we know this bird actually incubated and potentially even have chicks based on the light data. And then it undertook this fabulous long distance flight straight across the Pacific to back to Southeast Australia, Southeast Queensland, pardon me. And that bird did that flight in 3 days. So we were pretty excited by that because that's still one of the faster migrations that are on record for waders, and then was recaptured here nearly 12 months later. So that was sort of our first indication of usage of Papua New Guinea based on our tracking data. And then our bird that we recaptured 2 years later did a fairly similar pattern of migration. So it also stopped in Queensland. This time it went straight to Japan, and then it went on to northern Japan, or potentially even the island of Sakhalin. It was a bit hard to tell. And it came back through, and it has stopped off in PNG for about 3 weeks before returning. So these are fairly significant periods of time to be stopping on migration. So the satellite tracking, we've had a number of deployments of satellite transmitters. So the Wild Birds Society of Japan was the first to try it in July 2016, and they put 5 solar platform transmitter terminals on birds near Tomakomai in Hokkaido. And then the following year, we deployed 3 in Canberra, three of the same devices in Canberra. And then in February last year, and again January this year, we deployed 4 pinpoint Argos tags, which are just slightly lighter, and they're also GPS-enabled tags, so the location fixes are much more accurate. So here's just the deployment locations here in the 2 countries, and just some shots of the birds that we had tagged there, plus the people involved. So this is at Ben 10 Lake in Hokkaido, and this is at Jerrabomberra Wetlands in Canberra. So the data we got from those birds was really interesting, actually. So the Japanese were the lucky ones. They got the first almost full migration track, so across the Pacific there, and no, it did not stop in Palau. It's probably not quite the right trajectory for Palau, but that would have been pretty exciting. But it overflew the islands, and it came up here, and the last location fixes were just here on the just to the west of Jayapura on the island of New Guinea, and that was when the signals ceased. So that was obviously on southward migration. And then we had the 2 tag birds from Canberra. So we had this one in 2019, and then this one earlier this year. Both these birds stopped for 1 to 2 weeks in Papua New Guinea. And the very interesting thing with that was that the birds were using mostly these highland areas. So quite a few of the migration fixes, so the GPS fixes for this bird were between 2,000 and 3,000 metres, and then similarly this bird was using areas at about 2,000 metres. So we see 2 birds there spending a bit of time before continuing onwards, and unfortunately we did lose those signals before they ever attempted to fly to New Guinea. So what can we find out about these sites? Well, obviously not much if we can't get there, and that's something that we're pretty excited about trying to do in the near future. So I'll just start in this figure on the top right. So this was the area that the Japanese tag bird stopped near Jayapura, and you can see that it's probably fairly atypical habitat. It's a bit hard to be sure exactly where this bird was using. It's fairly forested. It's possible it might have been using these cleared areas over here. So we can't really say much about those habitats. But when we have a look at the aerial images for the other 2 birds, we find the majority of those records were obtained in these kinds of cultivated landscapes. So often near villages, sometimes in wetlands near villages, often within cultivated fields. And the interesting thing about that pattern of habitat use is it closely mimics what we see Latham snipe doing in Australia on their non-breeding grounds, where they'll often use highly modified landscapes, particularly during the day for roosting. So we're very interested to see their choice of habitat on migration was to be these somewhat modified landscapes. So this gives us quite a significant increase in our information about the species, because if you think about that map I showed back earlier, there really was just a couple of dots on the map. And if you look at the BirdLife International distribution map for the species, it doesn't show Papua New Guinea really at all featuring there. So we can see that based just on those 2 birds of tracking, with tracking information, and also on the one from up here from Japan, that we've actually got a much bigger distribution than we originally thought. And I mean, obviously this requires some field assessment to go in and have a look, well, you know, where exactly might these birds be distributed? And as we know, that's going to be very challenging because they're very difficult to identify and really need to be captured. But it does make us suspect that the many more observations of Gallinago snipe in New Guinea may in fact be Latham snipe rather than Swinhoe snipe, which is how they're generally recorded as. So, you know, this means that, you know, we need to understand more about what's going on in PNG, because we've got a small number of tagged birds all using this place on northward or southward migration. And that suggests to me that it's potentially a very important staging site, and therefore should be a really high priority for trying to improve our knowledge of this species and the conservation of this species into the future. I'd just like to thank a large number of volunteers and organisations and people. The dedication of people to this project has been absolutely incredible, and it could not have happened without a huge number of people putting voluntary time in. And I've noticed that's a repeated theme throughout this conference, and we're just really grateful for those contributions from the community. So thank you very much for listening.